In the summer of 1940, the war in Europe was over. France had fallen. The British Army, shattered, had been miraculously evacuated from the beaches of Dunkirk, but it had left its weapons, its tanks, and its dignity behind. The island of Great Britain now stood utterly, terrifyingly alone. It was cut off, besieged, and bracing for an invasion that seemed inevitable. And as Hitler paused, looking across the English Channel, his admirals pointed to a different map. They pointed to the vast, gray, empty expanse of the North Atlantic Ocean. The British homeland, they knew, was not a self-sufficient fortress. It was a tiny, overcrowded island that imported 55 million tons of food, fuel, oil, and steel every single year. It lived and died by its merchant shipping. Its lifeline was a single, tenuous, 3,000-mile-long convoy route that snaked from the ports of Halifax, Canada, to the docks of Liverpool. The Kriegsmarine, the German Navy, knew this. And its commander, Admiral Karl Dönitz, had a plan. He did not need a billion-dollar battleship like the Bismarck to win the war. He did not need an invasion. He needed one weapon. He needed the undersea boot, the U-boat. Dönitz calculated that if his U-boats could sink 750,000 tons of Allied shipping every month for 12 straight months, Great Britain would starve. Its factories would grind to a halt. Its oil reserves would run dry. It would be forced to surrender without a single German soldier ever setting foot on its soil. This was the Tonnage War. It was a cold, brutal mathematical equation. And for the first 2 years of the war, Dönitz and his Grey Wolves came terrifyingly close to solving it. This is the story of the Battle of the Atlantic, the longest, most savage, and most important campaign of the entire Second World War. But this is not a story of heroic ship duels and gentlemanly aces. This is the story of a secret, intellectual war. A war fought not by sailors, but by scientists and mathematicians. It was a war of signals, intelligence, cryptography, radar, and advanced physics, fought in secret wooden huts and university laboratories. And it was a war defined by a series of devastating moments of realization, as each side unleashed a new, secret weapon that suddenly and violently changed the rules of the game. When the war began in 1939, the U-boat was a flawed, if dangerous, weapon. The standard boat, the Type 7, was not a true submarine as we think of it. It was a submersible torpedo boat. It spent 90% of its life on the surface, where its diesel engines could push it along at a respectable 17 knots. It only dived to attack, or to escape, and escaping was difficult. The British Royal Navy, the masters of the sea, had the ultimate anti-submarine weapon, AS-stick. AS-stick, which the Americans would later call sonar, was a wonder of its time. A destroyer could send a high-frequency ping of sound through the water. If this ping struck a submerged U-boat, it would bounce back, creating an echo. The destroyer's operator could then tell the range and bearing of the hidden target. This ping was the single most terrifying sound a U-boat crew could hear. It was the sound of a metal coffin being found. Once found, the destroyer would steam overhead and drop depth charges. 300-pound oil drums of explosives set to detonate at a specific depth, crushing the U-boat's hull with water pressure. In the first few months, AS-stick worked. The British hunter-killer groups were sinking U-boats faster than Dönitz could build them. The U-boat, it seemed, was a relic. But Admiral Dönitz was not a conventional sailor. He was a revolutionary. He knew that AS-stick had one fatal, crippling flaw. It could only find U-boats that were underwater. A U-boat sitting on the surface was completely and totally invisible to AS-stick. The destroyer's sonar beam was pointed down, not up. So, Dönitz issued a new, radical doctrine that was pure, cold-blooded genius. His U-boats, he ordered, would stop attacking underwater in the daytime. Instead, they would use the cover of total darkness. They would attack on the surface, at night. This one decision changed everything. The U-boat was no longer a slow, blind, hunted whale. It was now a fast, low-profile, apex predator. A U-boat on the surface, at night, was almost invisible. Its tiny conning tower was a needle in a haystack of black waves. But the merchant ships, the huge 8,000-ton freighters, were silhouetted against the sky, puffing black smoke and throwing up a massive wake. They were easy targets. A German U-boat, AC, men like Otto Kretschmer or Gunther Prien, would stalk a convoy on the surface. He would slip inside the convoy's screen of destroyer escorts, who were all still pinging, uselessly, for a target below them. The U-boat would sail right alongside a freighter, fire its torpedoes from 500 yards away, and then crash dive into the chaos as the ship exploded. This was the beginning of the first happy time. From June 1940, after the fall of France, Dönitz moved his U-boat bases to the French coast. His boats now had direct, easy access to the Atlantic. The results were a slaughter. The British were losing ships at a rate that was almost double Dönitz's target number. The Tonnage War was being won. The British were desperate. Their convoy escorts were blind. They were sailing in circles, pinging an empty ocean, while the wolf was in the henhouse. But Dönitz had a problem. The Atlantic is a very, very big place. A single U-boat, a lone wolf, could search for weeks and never find a convoy. To win the Tonnage War, he couldn't just sink ships, he had to sink them efficiently. He needed his U-boats to hunt together. This was the birth of the wolf pack, or riddle tactic. The idea was simple. Dönitz would not send his boats to sea to hunt alone. He would spread them out in a long picket line across the main convoy route. The first U-boat to spot the convoy would not attack. He would surface, fall back, and become a shadower. He would get on his long-range radio and transmit a sighting report back to Dönitz's headquarters in France. And here's the critical, fatal, and most important fact of the entire campaign. Admiral Dönitz did not just command the U-boat arm, he micromanaged it. He was the wolf master. From his chateau in France, he would sit at a massive map, plotting the position of every Allied convoy and every U-boat in the Atlantic. When the shadower's report came in, Dönitz himself would get on the radio and transmit orders to all the other U-boats in the area, converge on these coordinates, attack tonight. For the Allied convoy, this was a death sentence. For 3 days, they would be stalked. Then, on the first night, the attacks would begin. Not from one U-boat, but from 5, 10, even 15 U-boats, all attacking on the surface from different directions at the same time. The convoy's few escorts would be overwhelmed, racing to pings that weren't there, firing star shells into the darkness, while one by one, their merchant ships, the tankers, the food ships, would explode in the night. The Wolfpack was a terrifying, brilliant, and lethally effective tactical system, but it was built on a single, invisible, and very dangerous assumption. It was built on radio. To make the Wolfpack work, Dönitz and his U-boats had to talk to each other constantly. The Shadower had to radio Dönitz. Dönitz had to radio the pack. The pack had to radio back. The Atlantic was filled with a constant stream of high-frequency Morse code chatter. And because the Germans were not stupid, they knew this was a vulnerability. So every single message, every sighting report, every coordinate, every attack order was encrypted. It was encrypted using the single most secret, most complex, and most unbreakable cipher machine in the world. A machine that the German High Command believed was pure mathematical magic. They called it Enigma. To the German High Command, the Enigma machine was not just a coding device. It was a mathematical fortress. It looked like a heavy, complex typewriter inside a wooden box. But inside, it was a nightmare of rotors, gears, and plug boards. When a German radio operator pressed the letter A, an electrical current would flow through 3 and later 4 spinning rotors, scramble through a plug board, and light up a different letter, say X. Because the rotors moved after every single keystroke, if you pressed A again, it might light up P. The number of possible combinations for setting up the machine was 158 quintillion. To break a message by brute force, checking one setting every minute, would take longer than the age of the universe. The Germans were absolutely convinced that it was unbreakable. They bet their entire war on it. But in the quiet, green countryside of Buckinghamshire, England, inside a drab, ugly Victorian estate called Bletchley Park, a strange army was gathering. These were not soldiers. They were chess champions, crossword puzzle addicts, linguists, and mathematicians. They worked in damp, freezing wooden huts sworn to total secrecy. And among them was a shy, eccentric genius named Alan Turing. Turing realized something the German admirals did not. Enigma was a machine. And a machine, no matter how complex, follows rules. It has a logic. And if you built a better machine, a faster machine, you could defeat it. Turing designed the Bomba. It was a massive, ticking, whirring electromechanical brain that could cycle through the Enigma's millions of settings, looking for the one logical pattern that made sense. But the Bomba needed a crib, a starting point. It needed a piece of the puzzle to work backward from. On May 9, 1941, deep in the Atlantic, the Royal Navy gave them that piece. The destroyer HMS Bulldog, escorting a convoy, managed to depth charge U-110 to the surface. The German captain, Fritz Julius Lemp, ordered his crew to abandon ship and set scuttling charges to sink the boat. But the charges failed to detonate. Lemp, realizing his mistake, tried to swim back to his submarine, but was shot and killed in the water. A British boarding party rowed over to the wallowing U-boat. They scrambled down the conning tower. And there, in the radio room, sitting on the desk, was the Holy Grail. a fully intact Enigma machine, and the codebooks for the next 2 months. The capture of U-110 was kept a terrifying secret. The prisoners were hidden away. The U-boat was allowed to sink. The Germans had to believe their codes were safe. Back at Bletchley Park, the codebooks allowed Turing and his team to read the German naval traffic in near real time. This was the British moment of realization. Suddenly, the Atlantic Ocean was no longer a dark, empty void. It was a lit room. The Admiralty in London could look at their plotting tables and see exactly where Dönitz was forming his wolf packs. They didn't send destroyers to hunt them. That would give away the secret. Instead, they simply radioed the convoys and told them to steer around the trap. For months, the U-boats sat in their patrol lines, waiting for convoys that mysteriously vanished into the mist, skirting around them by just 50 miles. The happy time was over. The U-boats were finding nothing. But the Germans were not standing still. The Battle of the Atlantic was a pendulum, swinging violently back and forth. In February 1942, the Germans introduced a new, more complex Enigma network for the U-boats, called Triton or Shark. It used a fourth rotor. Overnight, Bletchley Park went blind. The blackout lasted for 10 terrifying months. The convoys were vulnerable again. But the Allies had another secret weapon, one that didn't rely on reading the message, but on finding it. This was high-frequency direction finding, known as HFDF, or affectionately, Huff-Duff. Dönitz's Wolfpack tactics relied on that constant stream of radio chatter. The Shadower U-boat had to report the convoy's position. Huff-Duff was a specialized antenna installed on Allied destroyers. It could pick up that split-second radio transmission from a U-boat 20 miles away. It couldn't read the code, but it could point a line on a screen. The enemy is bearing 040 degrees. If two ships got a fix, they could triangulate the exact position of the U-boat. The hunter became the hunted. A U-boat captain would surface to send his report, thinking he was safe, only to see a British destroyer charging out of the fog, guns blazing, riding straight down the invisible line of his own radio wave. The U-boat's greatest strength, its communication, had been turned into its greatest weakness. But just as the British were beginning to master the wolf packs in the mid-Atlantic, a catastrophic new front opened up. On December 7, 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. 4 days later, Hitler declared war on the United States. Admiral Dönitz looked at the map of the American East Coast and saw a slaughterhouse waiting to happen. He launched Operation Paukenschlag, Operation Drumbeat. He sent his long-range Type 9 U-boats all the way across the Atlantic to the shores of New York, North Carolina, and Florida. The result was the second happy time. And it was a disaster entirely of American making. The U.S. Navy, led by Admiral Ernest King, was suffering from a lethal case of institutional arrogance. Admiral King despised the British. He refused to adopt their convoy system. He refused to turn off the coastal lights. He refused to listen to the hard-won lessons of 1940. When the German U-boats arrived off the American coast in January 1942, they couldn't believe their luck. The American cities, New York, Atlantic City, Miami, were fully lit. The neon signs and streetlights cast a bright glow miles out to sea. The U-boat captains didn't even need periscopes. They just sat on the surface at night, watching the American merchant ships passing in a steady stream, perfectly silhouetted against the glowing backdrop of the hotels and boardwalks. It was a shooting gallery. Tourists on the beaches of Florida could literally watch burning tankers sinking just offshore. In 6 months, the U-boats sank nearly 400 ships in American waters. It was a massacre that threatened to lose the war before America could even get into it. It took months of arguing and the direct intervention of President Roosevelt to force the U.S. Navy to swallow its pride, turn off the lights, and form convoys. By late 1942, the easy targets were gone. The American coast was dark and defended. The convoys were organized. The second happy time ended. Dönitz pulled his boats back to the one place where the Allies were still weak, the air gap. This was a massive 300-mile-wide hole in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. It was too far from Canada for aircraft to reach, and too far from Britain. In this black pit, the convoys were alone. There was no air cover to spot the surface U-boats or force them to dive. Here, the wolf packs could roam freely. As 1943 began, the Tonnage War reached its terrifying climax. Dönitz now had over 200 operational U-boats. He was sinking ships faster than the Allies could build them. The British food stocks were dwindling to dangerous levels. The invasion of Europe was impossible, because the troops and supplies couldn't cross the ocean. The Allies needed a miracle. They needed a technology that could turn the hunter into the prey, even in the black pit, even at night, and even when Bletchley Park was blind. And in a secret lab at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and a parallel lab in Britain, Scientists were putting the finishing touches on a device that looked like a small copper cup. It was called the cavity magnetron, and it was about to make the dark ocean transparent, the breaking of the shark. Enigma cipher by the Codebreakers at Bletchley Park was a moment of realization for the Allies. But it soon led to a moment of realization for the Germans, too. In his headquarters, Admiral Karl Dönitz was growing increasingly and paranoidally furious. He was moving his wolf packs into what should have been perfect, mathematically certain ambush positions. And time after time, his U-boat commanders were radioing back, reporting that the Allied convoys had vanished. The convoys, which should have sailed right into their grasp, were zigzagging at the last second, making inexplicable turns or disappearing in the fog. Dönitz was baffled. His first and most logical conclusion was that he had a traitor. He launched a massive counterintelligence investigation, looking for spies in his own headquarters at Lorient, convinced that someone was leaking his plans to the British. The one possibility he refused to entertain, the one thing he believed to be an absolute mathematical impossibility, was that the Allies were reading his Unbreakable Enigma messages. This was the power of ultra intelligence. It was a perfect, invisible shield. But a shield is a defensive weapon. It allowed the Allies to avoid the U-boats. To win the Battle of the Atlantic, they had to kill the U-boats. The problem was the Shadower, a single U-boat that first found the convoy. As long as that one U-boat was on the surface, radioing the convoy's position, the rest of the wolf pack was still coming. Ultra intelligence, which took hours, sometimes days, to decrypt, was too slow to stop this one real-time tactical threat. The Allies needed a new weapon, and they found it. It was a technology so brilliant and so crucial that its existence was kept a secret from the public for 30 years after the war, even longer than the Enigma. It was called high-frequency direction finding, or, as it was affectionately known, Huff-Duff. Huff-Duff was not a code-breaking machine. It did not care what the U-boat was saying. It only cared that the U-boat was talking. The system was simple, electronic fox hunting. When the Shadower U-boat surfaced and switched on his radio to send his sighting report, his signal would travel out in all directions. The British began to equip their convoy escorts, the destroyers and corvettes, with special Huff-Duff radio receiving antennas. A single escort could get a bearing on the signal, but it couldn't tell the distance. It just knew the U-boat was somewhere along that line. But the moment a second escort ship, miles away, picked up the same signal, the game was over. The two escorts would radio their bearings to the convoy commander, who would draw two lines on his map. Where the lines crossed, X marked the spot. That was the exact location of the U-boat. This was the moment of realization for the Allied hunter-killer groups. The U-boat commander, the Shadower, would be sitting on his conning tower, his binoculars trained on the distant convoy, radioing its position. He felt completely safe. He was on the surface, at night, where Azdik couldn't find him. He was hunting. But the Huff-Duff had turned the tables. The hunter was now the hunted. The convoy's escort commander, Captain Frederick Johnny Walker, the most famous of the U-boat killers, would get the Huff-Duff fix. He would detach two of his destroyers from the convoy screen. Go, he would order. Race down that bearing. Full speed. The U-boat commander would see nothing. He would hear nothing. And then, suddenly, out of the darkness, two black, high-speed shapes would appear, racing directly at him. He had just enough time to scream, "Alarm, crash dive," but it was too late. By the time the U-boat was underwater, the destroyers were already on top of him, and this time, they knew exactly where he was. The pings of the eye stick would lock on instantly. The depth charges would follow. Huff-Duff had solved the problem of the Shadower, but it only worked within a 25-mile radius of the convoy. The Atlantic was still a 3,000-mile wide ocean, and in the vast, empty middle, the U-boats had a sanctuary. This was the Atlantic Gap, or the Black Pit. It was a 1,000-mile wide stretch of the mid-Atlantic that was outside the range of Allied aircraft. Planes based in Canada could not reach it. Planes from Iceland could not reach it. Planes from Britain could not reach it. This gap was the U-boat's true home. This is where they could surface in broad daylight. This was where they would run their diesel engines to charge their batteries. This was where they would meet their milch cow supply submarines to get more fuel and more torpedoes. This was their safe haven. The solution was a new plane, the consolidated B-24 Liberator, but not a standard one. It was the VLR, Very Long Range Liberator. The Allies took a bomber, stripped out all the armor, all the extra machine guns, and all the comforts, and filled the bomb bay with massive, extra fuel tanks. The VLR Liberator was a flying gasoline can. It was slow, it was heavy, and it was miserable to fly. But it could stay in the air for 18 hours. It could close the Atlantic gap. The moment of realization for the U-boat crews was a new kind of terror. They would surface in the black pit 1,000 miles from land, believing they were in the safest place on Earth. And then, a 4-engine bomber would drop out of the clouds. A U-boat on the surface, with its thin, unarmored hull, was a dead U-boat. A single burst of cannon fire could tear it open. Its only defense was to dive. But it took 30 seconds for a Type 7 U-boat to crash dive. A B-24 diving at 300 miles per hour could kill it in 10. The U-boats were being hunted by day from the sky. So Dönitz, ever the adapter, issued a new order: we will surface only at night. The night, his original sanctuary, was once again his only hope. A pilot in a B-24, flying in pitch-black darkness, had zero chance of seeing a tiny gray conning tower on a black rolling ocean. The Allies were stumped. Their planes had radar. The ASV, or Air-to-Surface Vessel, Mark II. It was a crude, primitive radar that could pick up a U-boat, but it was not accurate enough to aim with. The radar operator would guide the pilot toward the blip, but in the final, critical mile, the blip would get lost in the clutter on the screen. The pilot was still blind. The solution was not a complex piece of physics. It was a simple, brilliant, brute force piece of engineering invented by a British wing commander named Humphrey de Verde Lay. It was the Lay light. The Lay light was a 50 million candle power searchlight, the size of a beer keg, strapped to the wing of the bomber. It was linked directly to the ASV radar. Now, imagine you are a U-boat commander in 1942. It is 2 a.m. You are on your conning tower in the black pit. You are relaxed, breathing the fresh, cold air, charging your batteries. The ocean is pitch black. You see nothing. You hear nothing. The Allied bomber, a VLR Liberator, is circling, 10 miles away, tracking you on his invisible ASV radar. He begins his attack run. You know nothing. At a range of 1 mile, the radar operator gives the order. The pilot flips a switch. Suddenly, your entire world explodes in light. A single, blinding, inescapable beam, as bright as the sun, has just lit up your conning tower. You are completely, totally, and perfectly illuminated. You are blind. Your crew is blind. And in the center of that light, you hear the roar of 4 engines. Before your hands can even find the dive alarm, the 4 600-pound depth charges are in the water. The Lee light was the U-boat's executioner. The night, Dönitz's greatest weapon, had just been turned into the single most terrifying place to be. The U-boat crews, who were not stupid, knew they were being found by something. They captured a piece of the ASV radar. Their engineers studied it, and they built a countermove. It was the Metox receiver, nicknamed the Biscay Cross for the shape of its crude wooden antenna. It was a simple, fuzzy buster radio. It did one thing: it listened for the ASV Mark II's radar waves. The moment of realization was now for the Allies. Their radar was no longer a secret. The German radar operator would get a beep in his headphones long before the plane's radar got a clear signal. The U-boat would dive and be gone, 10 minutes before the Lay light ever got in range. The tables had turned again. The Metox had neutralized the Allied air power, and Dönitz, now confident his boats were safe again, prepared for his final offensive. He was gathering the largest armada of wolf packs in history, preparing to finally and decisively win the Tonnage War. By March of 1943, Admiral Karl Dönitz was a man on the verge of total victory. His Metox radar detectors were working perfectly, neutralizing the Allied Lee light bombers. His Enigma code was, he believed, Unbreakable. And his shipyards, under the direction of Albert Speer, were finally delivering U-boats faster than the Allies could sink them. He now had over 200 operational Grey Wolves in the Atlantic. He was ready for the Inzieg, the final victory. He massed his U-boats into 3 massive overlapping picket lines and prepared to unleash the single greatest wolf pack assault of the war. His targets, 2 slow-moving eastbound convoys, HX-229 and SC-229 and SC-222, which were sailing almost side by side. What followed was not a battle. It was a 5-day running massacre. Over 40 U-boats fell upon the 2 convoys, firing torpedoes in a non-stop rolling attack. The handful of Allied escorts were completely overwhelmed, racing to Huff Duff, fixes, firing star shells, and depth-charging phantoms, while, all around them, their flock was being slaughtered. When the sun rose, the ocean was a graveyard of burning tankers and sinking freighters. In 120 hours, Dönitz's wolves sank 22 merchant ships, for a cost of only one U-boat. It was a staggering, catastrophic victory for the Kriegsmarine. Dönitz had just sunk over 141,000 tons of shipping in a single battle. He was ecstatic. He had finally, decisively won the Tonnage War. The Allied lifeline, he wrote, was about to be severed for good. The British Admiralty was in a state of terminal, existential despair. Prime Minister Winston Churchill, upon seeing the reports, wrote a grim private memo: "The U-boats are our greatest counter-embrace. We have failed to master them." The entire Allied war effort, the planned invasion of Italy, the build-up for D-Day, was on the verge of collapse. But the Allies were not defeated. They were preparing to unleash a perfect storm of new, secret, and revolutionary technologies, all at the exact same time. Dönitz's greatest victory was, in fact, the darkest, coldest moment just before the dawn. The first, and most important, breakthrough was radar. The Metox receiver was a brilliant counter-move, but it had a flaw. It could only detect the old Allied radar, the ASV Mark II, which operated on a 1.5-meter wavelength. British and American scientists, working in total secrecy at places like the MIT, that is, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology Radiation Lab, had already invented something far better. It was centimetric radar. Using a new, miraculous invention called the cavity magnetron, they built a radar set that operated on a tiny 10-centimeter wavelength. This new radar was a godlike weapon. First, it was so high frequency that the German medic's receiver could not hear it. It was completely, totally silent. Second, a short wavelength produced a picture on the radar screen that was not a fuzzy green blip. It was a photograph. An operator could see the tiny, sharp, clear outline of a U-boat's conning tower from miles away, in total darkness and in thick fog. In April 1943, the VLR liberators and the convoy escorts were secretly equipped with this new, silent, photographic radar. The moment of realization for the U-boat crews was a return to the terror of the lee light, but worse. They would be on their conning tower at night, charging their batteries. Their Metox receiver would be completely silent. They were, they believed, totally safe. And then, from one second to the next, the sky would explode. The lee light would flick on, already pointing directly at them, from less than a mile away. The depth charges would be in the water before the commander could even shout, "Deeve!" The second breakthrough was air power. The Atlantic Gap was finally and permanently closed, not just by VLR liberators flying from land, but by a new, ugly, and indispensable weapon, the escort carrier. The Jeep carrier, as the Americans called it, was a crude, cheap, slow-moving ship built on a merchant hull, with a tiny postage stamp flight deck welded on top. But it could carry 20 aircraft, and it sailed inside the convoy. The convoy no longer had to wait for air cover. It brought its own. The wolf pack, which loved to shadow a convoy in daylight, now found itself being relentlessly hunted 24 hours a day by planes equipped with the new, invisible, centimetric radar. The third breakthrough was intelligence. At Bletchley Park, the Codebreakers, led by Alan Turing, had finally mastered the shark cipher. They had built so many bombs that they were no longer decrypting Dönitz's messages in days. They were decrypting them in hours. The Walter intelligence was now real-time. Roger Wynne, at the Operational Intelligence Center, could now not only reroute convoys, but he could proactively send his new hunter-killer groups, which were now centered around their own escort carriers to go and wait for the U-boats at the exact coordinates Dönitz had just ordered them to. The fourth breakthrough was weaponry. The old depth charge was a dumb weapon. You had to sail over the U-boat, lose ass-stick contact at the last second, and drop a pattern behind you, hoping you would get lucky. But now, the Allies had the Hedgehog. The Hedgehog was a mortar that fired 24 small, contact-fused bombs in a pattern in front of the ship. The escorts no longer had to sail over the target. They could keep their ass-stick contact, pinging the U-boat until they were in range. Then, they would fire the Hedgehog. There was no massive water-churning explosion. There was just a quiet foot, as the bombs flew through the air. And then, if one of them hit the U-boat's hull, it would instantly explode, triggering all the other bombs in a sympathetic detonation. It was a lethal, surgical kill. Centimetric radar, real-time, Realtra, intelligence, permanent air cover from escort carriers, and the Hedgehog mortar. All of these perfect weapons came together at the exact same moment. This was May 1943. History calls it Black May. Dönitz, still euphoric from his victories in March, had no idea he was sailing his entire U-boat arm into a perfect technological buzzsaw. He ordered his wolf packs, in their greatest numbers ever, to attack the convoys ONS-5 and SC-130. It was a massacre. But this time, the massacre was not of the merchants. It was of the U-boats. A shadower U-boat surfaced to make its sighting report. A Huff-Duff fix got a bearing. A liberator from the convoy's own escort carrier, the USS Bogue, was vectored in. The U-boat's METOX was silent. The plane's cinemetric radar was perfect. The U-boat vaporized before it could send its message. Another wolf pack, groping blindly, found the convoy anyway and attacked. They were met by destroyers who could see them on the surface, at night, with their new radar. They crash-dived. They were instantly locked onto by Aztec, and they were annihilated by Hedgehog mortars. The numbers were incomprehensible. In the first 3 weeks of May 1943, Dönitz lost 12 U-boats. In the next week, he lost 17 more. By the end of the month, 41 of his veteran U-boat crews, his aces, were at the bottom of the Atlantic. This was a 30% loss rate in 1 month. It was unsustainable. It was suicide. On May 24, 1943, Admiral Karl Dönitz, a broken man, looked at the casualty reports. His unbreakable cipher was being read. His invisible U-boats were being seen. His safe haven of the night was a death trap. His entire tonnage war philosophy, which had come so close to victory, had just been rendered completely and totally obsolete. This was his moment of realization. He picked up his pen and wrote the single most decisive order of the campaign. All U-boats are to withdraw, immediately, from the North Atlantic convoy routes. The situation is untenable. The Battle of the Atlantic was, in a single 30-day period, over. The Grey Wolves had been broken. The lifeline was secure, and the path to D-Day was now, finally, open. On May 24, 1943, when Admiral Karl Dönitz ordered his U-boats to retreat from the North Atlantic, the main battle was over. But the war was not. Dönitz, still a fanatical believer in his unbreakable enigma, was in a state of profound denial. He could not accept that his codes were being read. He convinced himself that the Black May disaster was the result of a single, new, and unfortunate Allied technological breakthrough. He blamed a new, unhearable Allied radar. He believed that if he could counter that one weapon, the happy times would return. And so, for the next 2 years, the Battle of the Atlantic transformed. It was no longer a war of tonnage. It was a war of desperate, technological catch-up. Dönitz, now on the defensive, unleashed a series of brilliant last-ditch wonder weapons to counter the specific threats that had broken him. The first threat was Allied air power, the VLR, liberators and the escort carriers that owned the sky. His METOX receiver was useless. His solution was simple, and a stroke of genius, the Schnorchel, or snorkel. The Schnorchel was just 2 extendable steel pipes. It was a retractable breathing tube that allowed a U-boat to run its diesel engines while submerged at periscope depth. This one, simple invention, changed everything again. The U-boats no longer had to surface, ever. They could breathe underwater. They could recharge their batteries underwater. They could creep across the Atlantic, completely submerged, completely invisible to the radar-equipped planes that were hunting them. The Atlantic Gap no longer mattered. The entire ocean was now a U-boat sanctuary. The second threat was the Allied escorts, the hunter-killer groups led by aces like Johnny Walker, who had become so brutally affected with Huff-Duff and Hedgehog. To counter them, Dönitz unleashed the Gnat, or German Naval Acoustic Torpedo, codenamed Zonkönig, Ren. This was a fire-and-forget smart torpedo. It was not aimed at the convoy. It was aimed at the escorts. A U-boat, submerged and hidden, would fire the Gnat in the general direction of the convoy. The torpedo would then listen for the loudest, highest-pitched sound in the water, which was, invariably, the whine of a destroyer's fast-spinning propellers. The torpedo would hear the escort and turn and hunt it. In September 1943, the Gnats were unleashed, and for the Allies, it was a new Black May. The escorts, the hunters, were suddenly the hunted. Destroyers that were racing to a Huff-Duff fix would suddenly explode. The convoy shepherds were being killed, and the U-boat wolves were returning. But the Allied scientific chess match was now running at full speed. An unexploded Gnat was captured. It was flown to laboratories, taken apart, and analyzed. And in a matter of weeks, the Allied scientists had a countermove. It was a crude, simple, and brilliant decoy, codenamed Foxer. Foxer was just 2 hollow metal pipes towed 500 yards behind the convoy escorts. As they were dragged through the water, these pipes would churn up a massive, high-pitched clanging and gurgling sound, a noise far louder and more attractive than the ship's own propellers. The smart Gnat torpedoes, hearing this glorious loud noise, would gleefully turn and attack the fox or decoy, exploding harmlessly, hundreds of yards behind the ship. The smart torpedo had just been defeated by a noisemaker. Dönitz had one last card to play. He knew the Schnorchel was just a patch. He knew the Gnat was just a tactic. He needed a true revolution. He needed the Type 21 Electroboot. This was the wonder weapon that U-boat crews had dreamed of. It was not a submersible boat. It was the world's first true submarine. It was a machine designed from the keel up to live, fight, and win entirely underwater. The Type 21 was a design from the 1950s, arriving in 1945. It had a streamlined figure-8 hull that gave it a blistering underwater speed of 17 knots, faster than a surface destroyer could track it with ASTIC. It had a massive, triple-sized battery bank that allowed it to sprint underwater for hours. It had a silent running motor for creeping. It had a Schnorchel, of course, and it had a revolutionary, automated, hydraulic torpedo reloading system that allowed it to fire 18 torpedoes in 20 minutes, a barrage that a Type 7 would need 2 hours to accomplish. This was the weapon that could have won the Tonnage War. But it was far too little and far, far too late. The moment of realization for Dönitz was final. By the time the first handful of Type 21s were finally ready for combat, it was April 1945. The war was over. The Allied industrial machine, which had launched over 100 Jeep, escort carriers, and thousands of VLR Liberators, had already crushed him. Only one Type 21 ever went on a full combat patrol. It never fired a torpedo. The Battle of the Atlantic, which had been a war of statistics, ended with the most brutal statistics of all. The Allies had lost over 3,000 merchant ships and 175 warships. 30,000 Allied merchant sailors had lost their lives, but the cost for the Kriegsmarine was an apocalypse. Of the 40,000 German sailors who went to sea in the Grey Wolves, over 30,000 of them never came home. It was a 75% casualty rate, the highest of any branch of any military in the entire war. The final conflict historian verdict is this: the myth of the lone wolf. Ace was just that, a myth. Admiral Dönitz's brilliant Wolfpack system, which relied on centralized, micromanaged radio control, was his single greatest, fatal, strategic flaw. He had given his enemy a crib. He had handed the key to his entire strategy to the Codebreakers at Bletchley Park. The Battle of the Atlantic was not won by brave destroyer captains dropping depth charges. It was won, in total secrecy, by the quiet civilian mathematicians who read Dönitz's mind. It was won by the physicists at MIT, that is, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, who weaponized microwave radar. It was won by the Wrens, who operated Turing's bombs. It was the first and most decisive information war of the modern age. And it was, without question, the most important battle of the war. Because without the victory in the Atlantic, there would have been no food for Britain, no fuel for the bombers, no buildup of American troops, and no D-Day.